Chapter 5. Early in the following spring, Duke Hakon made ready for an inroad upon Denmark. The Danish king was to be forced to make reconciliation with his outlawed nobles upon such terms as they and the Norwegians should impose on him. Olav Audunsson set out for Tønsberg. He was one of the subordinate leaders under Baron Thor Hakonsson. He was not altogether glad to be away from home this summer. He was now striking root at Hestviken. It was his ancestral seat and his native place. He had so long been homeless and an outlaw. As he proceeded with repairing the decay of his property, so that the source which had long been dried up began to flow again with riches, and as he himself acquired a grasp and a knowledge of the work ashore and afloat, he came to take pleasure in these labours on his own behalf. He would have liked Bjorn to stay behind as his steward, but Bjorn had no mind to it. In the end, Bjorn accompanied Olaf as his squire, and an older man named Leif was to take charge of Hestviken together with the mistress of the house. He also felt some anxiety for Ingunn. About midsummer she would be brought to bed again. True, she had been in much better health than last time. She had managed her housekeeping and her share of the farm work the whole time, and now she had learnt and was not nearly so helpless as she had been when they were newly married. But Olaf was uneasy, just because he guessed that she awaited this child with impatient longing. If a disaster should befall it, she would be utterly struck down with sorrow. And he seemed to have a presentiment. That he should find a child in the house when he came home in the autumn seemed to him well nigh unimaginable. As soon as he reached Tønsberg, Olav Audunsson found old acquaintances of his years of outlawry wherever he turned. Earl Alf's men had flocked to the son-in-law of their slain chief, begging Lord Thor to take them into his service. Also among the Danish outlaws and their men, of whom the town was full, he met many that he had known while he was with the Earl. And one day a vessel ran into the harbour with letters from the Danish lords at Konungahella. Her captain, Asger Magnusson, was from Vikings Bay, and he and Olaf had been friends when Olaf was at Høvdingard. They were also kinsfolk, but very distant. In the evening he went up to the town with his Danish kinsman and had a carousing good time. He was much better for it afterwards. Lord Thor made Olaf captain of a little 16-oared galley, and his ship, with 3 small war vessels from the ship owners of the southeast of the Vik, was to sail under the orders of Asger Magnusson in the Wyvern, which the Norwegians called Yrmlingen. Feeling between the Danes and their allies was often barely friendly, for this time the greater part of the force was Norwegian. And now the Norwegians made no secret of what they intended by the expedition. King Eirik and Duke Hakon would claim the whole kingdom of Denmark in succession to their grandfather, the holy King Eirik Valdemarson, and make the country tributary to the crown of Norway. But the Danes did not like to hear this. They jeered at it, saying that their lords, the constable, Stig Anderson, and Count Jacob, had never bound themselves by promises to any king, and that the Norwegians would have reward enough for their aid when they helped themselves with both hands among the towns and castles of the Danish king. The Norwegians answered that when it came to dividing the spoil, the Danes were great tricksters who always knew how to get the best share for themselves. The Norwegians were the more numerous, but they were mostly peasants and seamen, less inured to war than the Danes. For nearly all of these had served for years under their outlawed chiefs, had grown hardy and resolute, and let the devil take every law but those of the fighting trade. But in this matter Earl Alf's old band were a match for the Danes, and more than that. Olaf and Asger had their hands full keeping the peace among their men. The war fleet lay off Hunhals, and the squadron to which Asger's and Olaf's small vessels belonged harried the northern coasts of the Danish islands. They did not come to Vikings Bay. Olaf had heard from Asger that the Danish king's men had stormed Høvdingard, burnt the manor, and pulled down the stone hall. Barnim Eriksson had fallen, sword in hand. So it booted not to think of him any more, else Olaf would have had a mind to see his uncle again. Now he could only let say a mass for the man and let it go. For that matter, he felt even less bound than before to his mother's land and kindred. There was something light-minded and foolhardy about these low, defenceless coasts that lay awash in the midst of the glittering sea. Above the broad, white beach, the yellow sand dunes sloped up, and the forest trees grew right out to the point. The stems of full-grown beeches and gnarled oaks stood just above the stormy waves. Turf and roots overhung the edge of the bluff like the threads of a torn tissue. It looked as if the sea had seized and bitten out great pieces of the naked bosom of the land. Olaf thought it ugly. Inland there were indeed fair tracts, great and lordly manors, rich soil, swine in the woodland, fat cattle in the meadows, fine horses in the parks. Nevertheless, he had never felt at home here. His homeland, the coast of Norway, ring within ring of rocky defences, shelves, skerries and holms, the inner channel, and at last the bright rocks of the mainland, before the first streaks of green soil stole down to the head of an inlet, as though spying out. The great manors lay inland, built mostly on ground from which one could see far afield and know what was coming. He thought of his own home, the bay within the bare rocks, the manor on the slope of the hill with the horse crag at its back. Ingunn would be up again by now. Maybe she was standing out in the yard, fair and young and slender again, sunning the child. For the first time he felt an intense desire for children in his home. But the bright vision was far off and incredible. He was back in the same life he had led when he was outlawed from Norway. The very feeling of wearing a coat of mail again was strangely good. Under the weight of it, his bodily forces seemed gathered together. It was good to feel the coolness of it when he was at rest, and how it shut in and saved up the heat of the body when fighting fit. It was like a warning to husband his strength, not to waste himself without plan or object. The trials of strength, afloat in rough weather or in a descent offshore, both one and the other demanded of a man that he should be prompt and vigilant, but at the same time reckless in his inmost will, not caring if he were conquered by the danger he was using all his powers to conquer. It was something of this sort that loomed within Olaf more as feelings than thoughts, and at times he felt a kind of repugnance as he recalled the 2 years he had lived upon the land as a married man. A vague pang at the heart, like a faint throbbing beneath a healed wound. Was he wasting his manly strength as he toiled in his loose woolen working clothes, powerless to determine what he would gain in the end by his trouble? And a kind of revulsion against the memories of his intimate life with the sickly woman. It was as though he surrendered his powerful youth and unbroken health in order that she might absorb vigour from his store, and in his heart he did not believe it would be of any use. Like swimming with a drowning companion hanging about one's neck. No choice but to save the other, or go down with him, if one would deserve the name of man. But one might be pardoned a failing at the heart, at the thought that the end was certain, to be drawn under, though one would struggle to the last because a man can do no less. Had she been in good health, and had it seemed natural to him that they should have children to reap where he sowed and inherit all his gains, then he would have looked upon his lot with different feelings. And now and then, when he tried to persuade himself into the belief that Ingunn might be well again, and that, for all he knew, he had a healthy, squalling infant son or daughter in the cradle at home, he would long for his house. But usually this longing was absent. He had a profound sense of well-being at having no one but himself, no other care but his duties as one among many subordinate captains in the army. He liked this life among no one but men. The women he saw ashore, old or ageing women who were charged with the food, venal hussies who were to be found wherever men were, he did not count these. There were wet days and nights afloat, fighting when they forced a landing. This had not fallen to Olaf's lot very often, nor was he altogether sorry for it. In all the years he had followed Earl Alf, he had never been able to overcome his dislike of useless cruelty, and the Danes were cruel when they harried their own country. Indeed, they would scarce have been anything else if they had harried another country. But down here they were used to the game. These coasts had seen plunder and rape and burning since there were men in Denmark. Olaf felt himself a stranger among his mother's people. It was true, his heart had been set upon warfare and fighting in his young days, but then the struggle was to end in a decision, death or victory. At times an image would rise before him, a hostile attack upon Hestviken. He defended himself in this home on the rock, with its back to the cliff. He drove the enemy downhill into the sea, or he fell on his own lands. The Danes were different, softer and tougher. They let themselves be chased away, peasants into the depths of the forests, lords overseas. But they came back, even as the waves of the sea retire and come again. They lost and they won, and neither one nor the other made much difference to their appetite or enjoyment of life. And with a strangely buoyant patience they bore the thought that things would never be otherwise. They expected to have to fight to all eternity, winning or losing along the low, wet shores, without calling any victory or defeat the last one. Then they were quartered ashore for a time. The men were closely packed in the houses of the town. The air was dense and hot, with rank smells, foul talk, ale and wine, belching, wrangling and quarrelling. There was fighting every night in the streets and yards. The captains had hard work to keep anything resembling peace and discipline among their bands. Rumours were always in the air, of ships' crews that were reported to have made successful incursions and carried off great booty. At Marstrand, a body of Earl Alf's old men-at-arms had fought with some German merchants and killed all their prisoners, in payment of an old score of their dead lords, it was said. The Danish king's fleet had taken the constable's fortress on Samso, and Stig Anderson himself had fallen, folk said. Among the Norwegians it was believed that Duke Hakon aimed at winning Denmark for himself, and that it was over this he had quarrelled with his brother the king. It was for this reason that King Eirik had sailed home to Bjorgvin already in the early summer, and that the captains of the king's fleet, lords from the west country and some few from Iceland, had wrought such destruction. But the Duke caused strict discipline to be kept in his army. He did not wish to see the total ruin of the land he intended for himself. Olaf wondered if the great lords knew the truth or falsity of all these rumours. In any case, the rank and file of the army had little grasp of what was going on, and the lesser captains, like himself, were reckoned with the rank and file, not with the lords, whom the fighting men usually knew only by name. But the less they knew of them, the more inclined they were to talk about them. That he himself was related to many of the outlawed Danish nobles, he was too proud to mention, if they did not remember him. His own chief, Baron Thor, counted him as no more than a subordinate captain, on the same footing as the masters of the ships of the country levies. He deemed Olav of Hestviken to be a brave man and a useful leader, but he had not distinguished himself in any way above the rest. He had had no opportunity of performing deeds that attracted attention. One thing resulted from this life. When Olav recalled his secret dread that there was some connection between the load on his conscience and the fact that there had been so little joy in his life with Ingunn, this now seemed to him a very preposterous thought. Imperceptibly, an idea of this sort had grown up in him during these 2 years. But these men among whom he was had robbed the peasants of their cattle, burnt houses and castles, had not only reddened their weapons in fight, but had often slain and maimed defenceless folk without just cause. Some had on them treasures that they were mightily afraid of showing. Likely enough, these things were stolen from churches, and although it was Duke Hakon's order that rape should be punished with death, it could hardly be thought that all the women and girls who drifted among the fighting men while the army was ashore had taken to this life entirely of their own free will. His own settlement with that Icelander seemed an utterly unimportant affair. Surely no one believed that all these fellows here confessed every scrap to such priests as were to be found. It was impossible that the men could remember everything, or the priests find time to hear such scrupulous confessions. Many a man who cheerfully took corpus domini before setting out certainly had heavy sins on his conscience which he had forgotten to confess. The wretched Teat had had his deserts. Olav now thought himself strangely foolish to have seen signs in this and that, in the chance words of strangers, in dreams that had come to him, in the colour and markings of his beasts. He had believed at last he felt God's hand over him, seeking to make him turn aside from the path he followed. Here, among all these men, where he himself was of so little account, his own affairs were also lessened in his eyes. So many a brave man's death had he seen and heard of that it was unreasonable to think that the Lord God was so scrupulous over the slaying of Teat, or that he singled out Olav Audunsson for chastisement, penance, and salvation, when there were great men enough who needed it much more, such as the Danish lords, for the way they treated their own countrymen. Even Ingunn's transgression seemed to grow less. He heard and saw so much out here. One day in late autumn he steered into the fjord. The sun was hot between the rain squalls that swept over the sea. There was a fresh breeze. The white spray shooting high under the bull gave him a greeting from afar. Up at the manor they had recognized his little craft. Ingunn stood on the quay as he came alongside, her coif and cloak fluttering about her thin, stooping figure. And as soon as he saw her, the husband knew that all was as it had been. The child had been stillborn, a boy again. 2 months after the new year, Ingunn fell sick again. She had miscarried, and this time her life was in danger. Olav had to fetch the priest to her. Sire Benedict counselled husband and wife to live apart for a year, and employ the time in penitence and good works. As weak as Ingunn Steinfinns' daughter now was, the priest thought it impossible that she could bear a living child. Olav was willing enough to try this expedient, but Ingunn was clean beside herself with despair when he spoke of it to her. "When I am dead," she said, "you must marry a young and healthy wife and have sons by her. I told you that I was broken down, but you would not let me go then. I have not long to live, Olav. Give me leave to be with you the little time I have left." Olav stroked her face and smiled wearily. She often talked of his marrying again, but she could not bear him to look at another woman, or to say 2 words to their neighbours' wives when he met them before the church door. Sleeplessness troubled him this spring even worse than the other years. With a heart heavy with compassion, he lay with his arm about the poor ailing woman, but he felt her clinging love as an encumbrance. Even in her sleep she lay with her thin arms clasped about his neck and her head resting on his shoulder. He was glad to get away from home when he set out for Tunsberg in the spring. The summer passed as the previous one, but whenever he thought of his home, Olaf was sick at heart. It didn't matter, he felt, that he had had so little joy in his life with her. The loss of Ingunn would mean the loss of half of his life. But she was well and cheerful when he came home late in the autumn. This time she was so certain that all would go well. But 6 weeks before Yule the boy was born, more than 2 months before his time. Some time before this happened, it became known in the countryside that Lord Thor Håkonsson had had Bjorn Egilson beheaded at Tunsberg. After the first campaign in Denmark, he had entered the Baron's service. He would not go back to Hestviken any more. When the war fleet returned to Norway this autumn, Bjorn had been on board the ship which brought Lord Thor himself home. And while on shipboard he had fallen out with another man and cut him down. When the Baron ordered him to be seized and bound, he had defended himself, wounded 2 men to the death, and given several others lesser hurts. Gudrid, Bjorn's wife, had died during the summer, and now Olav Audunsson thought he ought to help the orphans of the man he had liked so much. Their daughter, Thorhild Bjornsdatter, had held aloof from everyone. She was cross and taciturn. Olaf had rarely seen her, and scarcely exchanged 2 words with the girl, so he did not rightly know how he was to put his offer to her. But when Ingunn lay sick so near to Yule, and there was no mistress at Hestviken to cope with all the work that was at hand, their numbers were increased during the fishing season with the hunting of seals and auks, Olaf considered whether he should speak to Thorhild Bjornsdatter and ask if she would move to Hestviken and keep house for him. She was said to be a capable and industrious woman, and the mismanagement at Hestviken had now reached such a pitch that any housekeeper at all must be able to do the work better than the mistress. Ingunn was of little use when she was well, and she had had scarcely a day's health in 3 years. The food was so wretched that Olaf had had difficulty in getting housecarls this winter, and when strangers visited the house, he dreaded and was ashamed of what might be sent to the table. Except the fresh fish and frozen meat in winter, there was hardly anything that did not smell and taste abominably. The stores in the larder lasted an unaccountably short time, until Olaf discovered that many of the servants stole like magpies. Bought ale from town he always had to keep in the house, dear though it was, for Ingunn's brew had a bad name all along the fjord. Even the drink in the curd tub was not merely sour, but rotten. He himself had hardly had a new garment made at home since he was married, and his everyday clothes looked like beggars' rags. They were neither kept clean nor properly mended. He had proposed to Ingunn more than once that they should take a housekeeper, but each time she had been in utter despair, weeping and begging him not to bring such a shame upon her. It was in vain, he replied, that sickness is every man's master. It could be no shame to her. He saw that if he was to speak to Thorhild, he would have to do it without consulting his wife. The worst thing was about her children. She would have to bring the younger ones with her, and that was likely to lead to noise and disturbance, which Ingunn could not bear. The 6 surviving offspring of Bjorn and Gudrid were known to everyone as Thorhild's children. Gudrid had been an unnatural mother. She shook off one child after another. Her stepdaughter took it up, laid it in her lap, and fed it from a cow's horn. Gudrid cared for nothing but gadding about the neighbourhood. Thorhild had been betrothed in early youth to a lad of substance and honour, but he was near akin to that Gunnar whom Bjorn had had the misfortune to slay, and so the marriage came to nothing. Since then she had been drudging in their poor home, doing the work of a man and a woman together. Folk knew little about her, but the maiden was of the best repute. Nor was she ugly, but no one seemed able to conceive that Thorhild Bjornsdatter might change her condition. She was now no longer young, 8 or 9 and 20 winters old. The 2 eldest of her half-brothers were of an age to take service, but when this was spoken of, Thorhild answered that she needed them at home. One Sunday, not long after Ingunn fell sick, Olav saw Thorhild Bjornsdatter in church. She stood farthest back on the women's side, and was completely shrouded in a long and ample black cloak which she held closely about her. She had drawn the hood forward, and from time to time Olaf saw her face in profile, pale against the black material. She was like her father, the forehead high and abrupt, the nose long but finely curved, the mouth broad and colourless, but with lips tightly closed, as though in mute patience. Her chin was powerful and shapely, but her fair hair was faded and hung straggling about her forehead. Her complexion seemed grey and turbid from smoke and soot which had eaten into the skin. She had large eyes, but they were red-rimmed and bloodshot, as though she had stood too long over the fire in the narrow, smoky cot. Her hands, which held the cloak together, even when she clasped them in prayer, were not large, and the fingers were long, but they were red and blue, covered with broken chilblains, ingrained with black, and the nails were worn. And although she was so well shrouded, it could be seen that the girl held herself very erect. After Mass, Olaf stayed outside the church talking with some other Franklins, and it came about that he rode home alone. His people had gone on ahead. He had reached the place where the forest gives way to open ground, with some great meres and a little croft on the edge of the largest of them. The bridle path divides here just behind the outhouses, one path going to Rinjul and southward, and another down to Hestviken. As Olaf was turning into the road for home, he saw Thorhild Bjornsdatter standing outside the hut. She had taken off the cloak and gave it back to the woman from whom she had borrowed it. As she caught sight of the horseman, she turned abruptly and crossed the frozen mere as quickly as if she were flying from him. But Olaf had seen why she kept the cloak so closely about her. Without it, she was in her bare shift, of course undyed homespun. It was cut low at the neck, the sleeves reached to the elbows, and her arms were blue with cold, as were her naked ankles, which showed between the edge of the shift and the big, worn-out man's shoes she wore on her feet. She had bound a strip of homespun about her waist for a belt. Again, Olaf could not help being surprised at her erect bearing. She was dressed as working women are when they cut the corn on a summer's day. A memory flashed across Olaf's mind, of blue sky, sunshine, and warmth over the fields, where the women bent the sheaves of ripe, sweet-smelling corn. He watched the summer-clad maid flying across the frozen lake toward the edge of the wood, where the spruces were grey with rime. How she must feel the cold! She was bareheaded. Her plait of hair hung thick and straight down her resolute, unbending back. All at once Olaf felt an intense liking for her. He halted a while on the path, watching the girl. Then he rode on a little way, turned his horse, and set out across the mere. The croft which Bjorn Egilson had owned lay up on the slope on the other side. An alder thicket almost hid it from travellers on the road. Olaf saw that a good deal of clearing had been done since he had last had occasion to come here 2 years ago. Some small patches must have been dug last autumn. Some stones and roots were not yet cleared away. Farther up, the strips of stubble showed lighter than the rest of the rime-covered, swampy ground. The little byre which Bjorn had put up a few years before shone yellow with its fresh logs, but he had never got the dwelling-house built. They were still living in the round turf hut. Torhild Bjornsdatter came out when she heard the horseman. The children peeped behind her in the doorway. She stepped outside and stood erect, blushing slightly and glancing ungraciously at the man as he dismounted, and she guessed he had some business with her. Olaf tied Uppelvit to a tree and covered him with his grey fur cloak. "Can I come in, Torhild? There is a matter about which I would like to speak with you." He did not wish her to stand there in the cold. She was now barefooted. Torhild turned and went in. She laid a worn sheepskin on the earthen bench, bade her guest be seated, and offered him a ladle of goat's milk from a bowl that stood behind him on the seat. The milk tasted and smelt strongly of smoke, but Olaf was fasting and thought it good. The room was like a cave, with a narrow passage between the 2 benches of earth which filled it entirely. Torhild sat down opposite her guest. She had a 2-year-old child on her lap. Another girl, a little older, stood behind her, with her arms about her neck. The 2 eldest boys lay by the fire near the door, listening to the talk between their sister and the stranger. After they had spoken of other things for so long as was proper, Olaf mentioned his business. She must have heard what a pass he had come to at home, how little likely it was that his wife would be fit for any work that winter. If Torhild would grant them a boon and help Ingunn and him in their difficulty, they would never be able to thank her enough. Olaf spoke as one asking a favour. He liked her so much. She looked strong, with her broad, straight shoulders, high, firm bosom, and powerful hips. She had never let herself be bent double by all her drudgery here between the cot and the little byre. Torhild raised some objections, but Olaf replied that it was clear she should have leave to bring all 6 children with her to Hestviken. He had not thought of offering to receive more than the 2 eldest. They could no doubt be of some service, and the 2 youngest who could not be parted from their foster-mother. The middle ones they could surely find a home for in the neighbourhood. Her beasts, the cow, 4 goats and 3 sheep, he would also receive. When the roads were fit for sleds, he would send for the fodder she had stacked. And he would see to it that the fields here at Rundmeyer were manured and sown in the spring. The end of it was that Torhild took service with Olaf and was to move to Hestviken as soon as she had made ready a few clothes for herself and the children. Olaf promised to provide the material. He himself rode up with it next day. There was no need for her fellow servants to know how poor she had been. He had thought of telling Ingunn of his agreement with Torhild the same evening, but when he came in to the sick woman, she lay in a doze, so faint and bloodless that she looked as though she could neither hear nor answer him. So he merely sat on the bedstead beside her. Her face was fearfully wasted. The eyelids lay like thin brown membranes over the sunken eyes. Her skin was grey and flecked with brown over the cheekbones. The dark streaks which had come with her second child had never gone away. Her white linen shift was fastened with a gold brooch. Her throat was wizened like a plucked fowl's. He remembered that Torhild's grey woolen shift had been held together with a pin of sharpened bone, but her throat was as round as the stem of a tree, and her bosom was full and high. She was sound and strong, although her lot in life had been so heavy and toilsome. His own poor creature was well provided with all that was needed to make pleasant the lot of a young wife, and here she lay, for the 4th time in 3 years, childless and broken in health. Olav stroked her cheek. "Did I know some means of helping you, Ingunn mine?" He did not bring himself to tell his wife that he had hired a housekeeper until Thorhild moved in with all her following of children and animals. Ingunn looked displeased, but all she said was, "So it is, I think. You must have one that can take charge of the house. I was never good for anything, and now it seems I can neither live nor die." Ingunn lay sick a great part of the winter, and it looked as though she had spoken truly. She could neither live nor die. But then she began to mend, and by the first days of Lent she could sit up. Spring came early on the fjord that year. It was expected that the levies would be called up again for the summer. The Franklins were now heartily sick of the war with Denmark. No one believed that either the king or the duke would reap anything by it in the end but the loss of their mother's inheritance, which indeed they had wrested from their cousin, the late King of Denmark, before he was murdered. That spring, Sire Benedict announced that he intended to go to Nidaros for the vigil of St. Olav. Many of the folk of his parish joined him for the sake of having good company on this pilgrimage, which every man and woman in Norway desired to make at least once in their lives. Olav leapt at the thought, seeing in it a hope and a remedy. Ingunn should take part in the journey. It seemed a very prodigy that she had been so well of late, and ailed not at all. She must needs make use of this rare occasion. At first Ingunn was by no means willing to go, if Olav could not go with her. But then the thought came to her that she could go home and see her sister and brothers, accompany the pilgrims only so far as Hamar. Olav was displeased with this. He wished her to make the pilgrimage, then perhaps she would be restored to health at St. Olav's shrine. If she was equal to travelling so far into Heidmark, then she could surely make the whole journey. They were to move slowly, for there were many sick people in the company. But when he saw how she longed to see her own family again, he gave his consent. He accompanied her as far as Oslo, and stayed in the town a few days, buying and selling. One morning Ingunn was sitting in the inn when Olav entered hastily. He searched in their leather bags, did not find what he wanted, and opened another bag. There he came upon some little garments. They might have fitted a child of 4 years. Unconsciously his eyes fell upon his wife. Ingunn's head was bent, and her face was red as fire. Olav said nothing, packed the bag again, and went out.